The rain fell like judgment on the marble steps of the Bellwood Community Hall, and inside, beneath chandeliers that had witnessed 3 generations of black excellence and prosperity, a young woman named Celeste Monroe stood trembling in a torn evening gown, while 200 of the city's most influential people watched her humiliation unfold in real time. Her hands shook as she tried to hold together the delicate fabric that had been ripped deliberately, viciously, by people she had trusted just hours before. The man she loved, the man who had promised her forever, stood 15 feet away, with his arms crossed and his face carved from stone, looking at her like she was something disgusting. He had scraped off his expensive Italian leather shoes. Deshaun Harrington, heir to a real estate empire worth $50 million, watched the woman he had proposed to 6 months earlier with the cold detachment of a stranger who had never known her name. His mother, Vivian Harrington, stood beside him in an emerald gown that cost more than most people earned in a year, her smile sharp enough to cut through steel and twice as deadly. Celeste had walked into this evening believing she was stepping into her future, believing that the engagement party would be the beginning of something beautiful, the start of a life she had never dared to dream possible when she was sleeping in shelters and wondering where her next meal would come from. She had spent 3 hours getting ready in the guest room of the Harrington estate, carefully applying makeup she had saved for months to buy, styling her hair with YouTube tutorials because she could not afford a professional stylist, slipping into the dress that Vivian herself had selected for her, with what Celeste had foolishly interpreted as maternal affection. Deshaun's sister, Brianna, had helped her with the zipper, complimenting her figure, telling her she looked like royalty, making her feel for one precious moment like she truly belonged in this world of wealth and privilege and power. But when Celeste had walked down the grand staircase to join the party, when she had smiled at the guests who represented everything the Harrington family had built over 4 generations, she had noticed something strange in their eyes. The guests had not looked at her with admiration or welcome or even curiosity, but with something closer to pity, mixed with barely concealed contempt, as if they were watching a lamb being led to slaughter and found the spectacle both tragic and entertaining in equal measure. Celeste had felt the first cold finger of dread trace down her spine when she saw Vivian whisper something to a distinguished older woman in pearls, saw the way that woman's eyes had flickered toward Celeste with unmistakable judgment before she nodded in agreement. Then Deshaun had called for everyone's attention, and Celeste had thought this was the moment. This was when he would toast their love and their future and seal their commitment in front of everyone who mattered. Instead, he had looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the nights they had stayed up, talking about their dreams, no memory of the promises he had whispered when they were alone, and the world felt like it belonged to only them. Deshaun had spoken in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire hall, his words precise and devastating, like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. He told the assembled crowd that Celeste Monroe was a con artist, a gold digger who had infiltrated his household by pretending to be a humble housekeeper, when in reality she had been plotting from day one to seduce him and gain access to the Harrington fortune through manipulation and lies. He claimed she had gone through private family documents without permission, that she had invented a story about his biological mother to create emotional leverage, that everything about her was calculated deception designed to exploit his kindness and his family's generosity towards someone they had foolishly believed was genuinely in need of help. Vivian had stepped forward then, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy, as she explained to the shocked guests how they had discovered Celeste's true intentions, how they had given her every chance to come clean and leave with her dignity intact, how she had instead doubled down on her lies and forced them to expose her publicly. Celeste had tried to speak, tried to defend herself, tried to explain that everything Deshawn was saying was a twisted version of the truth, designed to destroy her credibility before she could reveal what she actually knew about his past and his family's secrets. But Brianna had moved quickly, grabbing Celeste's purse from where she had set it down on a nearby table and dumping its contents onto the polished marble floor with theatrical flair that suggested she had rehearsed this moment, specifically for maximum dramatic impact. Keys, wallet, lipstick, and a sealed envelope tumbled out, and Brianna had picked up that envelope with mock curiosity, reading aloud the words written on the front in shaking handwriting that clearly belonged to someone who had been very sick when they wrote it. The envelope said simply, "To my son," and Brianna had turned to the crowd with exaggerated shock, asking in a voice that managed to sound both innocent and accusatory whether anyone believed this was a coincidence, whether anyone thought it was normal for someone to carry around a letter, supposedly from Deshawn's dead birth mother, whom none of them had ever met. Then Brianna had done something that made Celeste's blood turn to ice in her veins, and her heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity of suspended horror. She had torn the envelope in half, slowly and deliberately, maintaining eye contact with Celeste the entire time, with a smile that promised this was only the beginning of her suffering. The letter inside, painstakingly written by Regina Foster during the final weeks of her life, when her hands shook from illness and her heart was breaking from decades of searching for the son she had never stopped loving, fell to the floor in two pieces like broken promises scattered at Celeste's feet. Celeste had screamed then, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the hall and made several guests actually flinch with discomfort at the raw emotion in her voice. She lunged forward, breaking free from the security guards, who had been slowly moving closer throughout Deshawn's speech, scrambling on her hands and knees to gather the torn pieces of Regina's final message to her son, the only tangible proof she had left of a mother's love that had survived 23 years of separation and systematic erasure. The security guards had grabbed Celeste roughly, hauling her to her feet while she clutched the torn letter fragments against her chest like they were sacred relics that could save her from this nightmare if she just held them tightly enough. Deshawn had watched without moving to help her, without showing any sign of the man who had once held her during thunderstorms and told her she was the most real thing in his carefully constructed life. Vivian had made a gesture elegant and dismissive, and the guards had dragged Celeste toward the door, while the guests parted to let them through, their faces showing varying degrees of disgust, satisfaction, or uncomfortable fascination with the spectacle of someone else's complete destruction. Celeste had twisted in their grip one last time, looking back at Deshawn with desperation and fury warring in her chest, and she had shouted the words that made Vivian's perfect composure crack for just a fraction of a second. She told him that his mother, his real mother, had died 3 months ago calling his name, that Regina Foster had spent 23 years searching for the baby who had been stolen from her, that everything he knew about his identity was built on lies and fraud and the systematic violation of a teenage girl's parental rights. The guards threw Celeste out into the rain like she was garbage that needed to be removed before it contaminated the pristine environment inside, and she landed hard on the wet marble steps, her torn dress soaking through immediately as water poured from the sky in sheets that felt like the universe itself was weeping for the injustice of this moment. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the sound of music and laughter that had resumed inside, as if nothing significant had just happened occurred, as if a woman's dignity had not been shredded in front of 200 witnesses who would spread this story across the entire community by morning. Celeste sat there on those cold steps, with rain mixing with her tears, with pieces of Regina's letter clutched in her fists, with the engagement ring still on her finger, because they had not even bothered to take it back before throwing her out. She had nothing now, no job, because she had quit her position as the Harrington housekeeper when Deshawn proposed. No apartment, because she had given up her tiny studio to move into the estate. No savings, because every penny had gone toward trying to look presentable, enough to fit into Deshawn's world. To understand how Celeste Monroe ended up destroyed on those marble steps in the rain, you have to go back 23 years to a night when a 16-year-old girl named Regina Foster gave birth alone in a free clinic on the south side of Chicago, surrounded by overworked nurses who processed her like paperwork that needed to be filed and forgotten as quickly as possible. Regina had been terrified, barely more than a child herself, with no family to support her and no resources to draw on, except her own desperate determination to keep the baby she already loved more than she had ever loved anything in her short, difficult life. The labor had been long and brutal, 47 hours of pain that would have broken someone with less strength. And when they finally placed the baby boy in her arms, for those few precious moments before the complications started, Regina had looked into his face and made a promise that she would find a way to keep him, that she would work 3 jobs if necessary, that she would give him everything, even if it meant she had nothing left for herself. But Regina's body had other plans, and she started hemorrhaging before she could even choose a name for her son, bleeding so profusely that the nurses had to rush her into emergency surgery, while someone else took the baby away to the nursery where he would spend his first days of life, surrounded by strangers instead of the mother who had carried him for 9 months. When Regina woke up 2 days later, weak and disoriented from blood loss and medication, she asked immediately about her baby, and the social worker who appeared at her bedside had worn the practiced expression of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had learned to protect herself emotionally from the devastation she caused. The woman explained gently but firmly that Regina's baby had been placed into emergency foster care during her medical crisis, that she was too young and too sick to provide adequate care, that the state had an obligation to ensure the child's welfare, even if it meant separating him from his biological mother. Regina had begged, pleading with tears streaming down her face, promising she would do anything they required if they would just let her hold her son again. The social worker, a woman named Dorothy Kane, who would carry the guilt of this day for the rest of her life, told Regina that if she truly loved her baby, she would sign the adoption papers that were already being prepared, papers that would give him a chance at a stable life with parents who could provide everything a child deserved. Regina had been heavily medicated, barely coherent, clinically depressed from the trauma of nearly dying in childbirth, and in no condition to make legal decisions that would alter the course of her entire existence. But a lawyer had appeared at her bedside before she was even strong enough to sit up on her own. A sharply dressed man who worked for a firm called Harrington and Associates, and he had placed documents in front of her while explaining in soothing tones that this was the best option for everyone involved, especially for her innocent baby, who deserved better than what a 16-year-old single mother could possibly provide. Regina had signed with shaking hands because they told her she had no choice, because they told her the decision had essentially already been made, because she was too young and too weak and too broken to fight against the machinery of a system designed to remove children from mothers who failed to meet arbitrary standards of worthiness. The baby was adopted within a month by Gerald and Vivian Harrington, a wealthy black couple who had been trying for years to have children naturally and had finally accepted that their only path to parenthood would be through adoption. Vivian had wanted a son specifically, a perfect baby boy she could mold into the heir her husband's real estate empire required, someone who would carry the Harrington name with pride and continue the legacy they had worked so hard to build. The adoption was arranged privately, quickly, and with enough money changing hands to ensure that all the proper paperwork was expedited and all the inconvenient questions were buried before anyone could ask them. Gerald Harrington's law firm handled everything personally, making absolutely certain that Regina Foster's parental rights were terminated so completely that she would have no legal recourse to ever reclaim her child, no matter how much her circumstances might improve in the future. They changed the baby's name from the one Regina had whispered to him during those brief moments she held him to Deshaun Gerald Harrington, erasing the last connection between mother and son, as if Regina had never existed at all. Regina spent the next 23 years searching for her son, with a desperation that consumed every aspect of her existence and left no room for healing or moving forward or building any kind of normal life. She worked 3 minimum-wage jobs simultaneously, sleeping 4 hours a night in shelters or on friends' couches or sometimes in her car when she finally saved enough to buy a vehicle that barely ran. Every spare dollar went toward private investigators who took her money and delivered nothing, toward filing petitions with adoption agencies that claimed her records had been lost, toward making phone calls to social workers who told her the case was closed and she needed to move on for her own mental health. Regina aged rapidly under the weight of her grief, her face developing lines that made her look decades older than her actual years, her body breaking down from stress and inadequate nutrition and the emotional toll of loving someone she could not find. She became a fixture in the downtown area where homeless populations gathered, a woman people recognized but rarely spoke to because her obsession with finding her lost son made her seem unstable, unreliable, someone to be pitied but not helped. 3 months before the engagement party that would destroy Celeste's life, Regina collapsed on a downtown sidewalk near the business district, her heart finally giving out from decades of untreated hypertension and the accumulation of stress that no human body was designed to endure indefinitely. Most people walked past her without stopping. Another invisible homeless woman in a city full of them. Someone else's problem that busy professionals could ignore while hurrying to important meetings. But a young woman named Celeste Monroe, who was rushing to catch a bus to her job, cleaning houses for wealthy families, stopped when she saw Regina lying on the cold concrete. Celeste had been homeless herself for 2 years after aging out of foster care at 18, with no family, no support system, and no understanding of how to navigate a world that seemed designed to punish people who started life with nothing. She knew what it meant to be invisible, to be the person everyone looked past, to be someone whose suffering barely registered as real to people who had never experienced that particular flavor of desperation. Celeste called 911 and stayed with Regina until the ambulance arrived, then insisted on riding to the hospital because she could not bear the thought of this woman dying alone without anyone to hold her hand or speak her name. Regina regained consciousness in the emergency room long enough to grip Celeste's fingers with surprising strength and whisper the words that would change both their lives forever. She told Celeste about her son, about the baby taken from her 23 years ago, about the decades spent searching through a system designed to hide adopted children from birth parents who loved them. Regina pulled out a worn photograph from the pocket of her jacket, a picture of herself at 16, holding a newborn baby, for what she did not know would be the last time, and she begged Celeste to find him, to tell him he was loved, to make sure he knew his mother had never stopped looking, and never would have stopped until her last breath. The doctors delivered their prognosis quickly and without much hope, explaining that Regina's heart was failing, that she had maybe weeks to live if she was lucky, that there was nothing more they could do except make her comfortable. Celeste made a promise at Regina's bedside, swearing she would find the son who had been stolen and deliver the message his mother needed him to hear before death claimed her permanently. She spent every free hour researching adoption records, calling agencies, piecing together fragments of information that might lead her to Regina's baby. The trail was cold and deliberately obscured, but Celeste had learned patience and persistence from her own years navigating systems designed to lose people like her. She discovered that the adoption had been handled privately by Harrington and Associates, a prestigious law firm that specialized in serving wealthy black families who wanted to avoid the public adoption process. That name triggered something in Celeste's memory, and when she researched further, she found that the firm's founding partner, Gerald Harrington, had a son named Deshaun, who was exactly the right age, born in exactly the right month, adopted in exactly the right year. The connection seemed impossible, too convenient to be real. But when Celeste showed Regina a photograph of Deshaun from the Harrington family's public social media accounts, Regina had broken down completely, sobbing that she recognized her baby's eyes in the face of this grown man she had never been allowed to know. Regina died 3 days later in a charity hospital bed with Celeste holding her hand, and her final words were a desperate prayer that her son would somehow learn the truth, even though she would not live to tell him herself. Celeste sat with Regina's body for 2 hours after the machines stopped beeping, crying for this woman, who had become something like family in the brief time they had known each other, mourning the profound injustice of a mother who died without ever holding her child again. The hospital staff eventually asked Celeste to leave so they could process the body, and Celeste walked out into a world that suddenly felt heavier, weighted with the responsibility of a promise that she had no idea how to keep. She could not simply approach Deshaun Harrington and tell him his entire identity was built on lies without proof, without evidence, without something more substantial than the word of a dead homeless woman and the girl who had befriended her. So, Celeste made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and probably both simultaneously. Celeste applied for a job as a housekeeper at the Harrington estate, lying on her application about her employment history and references using fake credentials that would not hold up under serious scrutiny, but were good enough to get her through the door of a family that went through service staff quickly enough that they could not afford to be too selective. She was hired within a week and found herself working 16-hour days, cleaning marble floors, serving meals, and trying to remain invisible while learning everything she possibly could about the family that had built their perfect life on Regina's stolen motherhood. The work was exhausting and demeaning, with Vivian Harrington treating staff like animated furniture that existed solely to maintain her comfort. But Celeste endured it because she had endured worse, and because she had a purpose that transcended her own suffering. She watched Deshaun from a distance at first, studying him for signs of the baby Regina had loved, looking for traces of the mother in the son, who had no idea what had been taken from both of them. Deshaun noticed Celeste after 3 months, not as a servant, but as a woman, and their first real conversation happened late one night when he found her reading in the estate library during a rare break from her duties. He had asked what she was reading, and she had shown him the book on adoption law she had borrowed from the public library, telling him she was interested in social work and family reunification. They talked for 2 hours that night about systems that separated families, about the trauma of growing up without knowing your origins, about the hunger for identity that haunted people who had been told their birth parents did not want them. Deshaun confessed that he was adopted, that his parents had told him when he was 12, that he sometimes wondered about the woman who had given birth to him, even though the Harringtons insisted she had willingly surrendered him because she could not provide adequate care. Celeste had nearly told him the truth right then, nearly revealed everything about Regina and her decades-long search, but something held her back, some instinct that Deshaun was not ready to hear, that his entire existence was built on lies his parents had paid to maintain. Instead, Celeste and Deshaun continued their late-night conversations, and somewhere in those talks, a genuine connection formed between them that went beyond Celeste's mission to deliver Regina's message. Deshaun was lonely despite his wealth, trapped by expectations and family obligations that left little room for authentic connection with people who saw him as something other than a Harrington heir. Celeste was the first person in years who seemed to care about his thoughts rather than his bank account, who asked him questions about his dreams instead of his portfolio. 6 months after Celeste started working at the estate, Deshaun did something that shocked his entire family by proposing to her, presenting her with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and telling her she was the most real thing in his carefully constructed world. Vivian's reaction was immediate and furious, taking her son aside and demanding to know whether he had lost his mind by proposing to someone who cleaned toilets for a living. Gerald was more measured, but equally concerned, warning Deshaun that this relationship would damage his social standing and potentially compromise business relationships built on family reputation. But Deshaun had insisted, telling his parents that Celeste represented something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it, someone who loved him for himself rather than what he could provide or what family name he carried. Vivian had smiled tightly and told her son that if he truly loved this girl, then of course the family would welcome her, though the coldness in her eyes suggested she was already planning something that would test whether Celeste's feelings were genuine or calculated. The engagement party was scheduled for 6 months later, supposedly to give Celeste time to prepare for entering their social circle, but actually to give the Harringtons time to investigate every aspect of her past and present. They hired private investigators who discovered Celeste's history in foster care, her time homeless, her sudden interest in adoption law that coincided with Regina Foster's death. They found hospital records showing Celeste had been present when Regina died, visitor logs proving she had spent significant time with this woman who claimed to be Deshaun's biological mother. And most damning of all, they found evidence that Celeste had been researching the Harrington family's adoption arrangements months before she applied for a job at their estate. Vivian presented this evidence to her husband and daughter in a family meeting that excluded Deshaun, explaining that Celeste Monroe was clearly running a con designed to infiltrate their family and potentially blackmail them with fabricated stories about Deshaun's adoption. The fact that Regina Foster had genuinely been Deshaun's birth mother was irrelevant to Vivian because Regina had signed legal documents surrendering her parental rights, which meant she had no claim to the son Vivian had raised and shaped into the man he had become. Brianna argued that they should simply pay Celeste off and make her sign a non-disclosure agreement, but Vivian refused, insisting that paying money would be tantamount to admitting wrongdoing when they had done absolutely nothing wrong by adopting a baby whose birth mother could not care for him. Instead, Vivian devised a plan that would publicly destroy Celeste's credibility so thoroughly that even if she tried to tell her story afterward, No one would believe a word from the mouth of a proven liar and manipulator who had attempted to deceive one of the community's most respected families. The engagement party became the stage for Celeste's destruction, carefully choreographed by Vivian, with Brianna's enthusiastic assistance and Deshawn's reluctant participation after his mother convinced him that Celeste had been using him from the beginning. Vivian showed Deshawn the evidence their investigators had gathered, twisting every fact to support the narrative that Celeste was a con artist who had deliberately targeted him after learning about Regina's delusional search for a son who had been legally adopted decades earlier. Deshawn wanted to believe Celeste was innocent, wanted to think the woman he loved was incapable of that level of deception, but the evidence seemed overwhelming, and his mother's arguments were persuasive. Vivian explained that Celeste had likely befriended Regina, specifically to gain information she could use to manipulate the Harrington family, that everything from her job application to her romance with Deshawn had been calculated steps in a con designed to either marry into wealth or extort money through threatened exposure of adoption records that were completely legal and proper. By the time Vivian finished presenting her case, Deshawn was convinced that his entire relationship had been a lie, that Celeste had never loved him at all, that he had been played for a fool by someone who saw his vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. So Deshawn agreed to his mother's plan for the engagement party, telling himself he was protecting his family from a manipulative criminal, even as something deep in his chest screamed that he was making a terrible mistake. The night of the party, Brianna had deliberately torn Celeste's dress in the dressing room, knowing the humiliation would make Celeste seem unstable and desperate when they revealed her supposed deception. Every element was designed to maximize Celeste's suffering and ensure that she would leave not just disgraced, but completely broken, unable to recover enough to ever threaten the Harrington family again. And it had worked perfectly, with Celeste thrown out into the rain clutching pieces of Regina's torn letter, while 200 witnesses believed she was a con artist who had gotten exactly what she deserved. But what the Harringtons did not know was that Dorothy Kane, the social worker who had processed Regina's adoption 23 years earlier, had been watching the news coverage of Deshawn Harrington's engagement to a former homeless woman with growing horror as she recognized the name and realized that Regina had finally, impossibly, gotten close to her son through this girl she had befriended in her final days. Dorothy had carried guilt about Regina's case for 23 years, knowing that something had not been right about the adoption, even though she had been too young and too intimidated to question her supervisors when they rushed the paperwork through. She had kept copies of documents she was supposed to have destroyed, files showing that the Harringtons had paid significant money to ensure Regina's parental rights were terminated quickly and permanently, records proving that Regina had never been given proper counseling or adequate time to make an informed decision about surrendering her baby. When Dorothy saw Celeste's humiliation broadcast across social media, when she read posts from people who had attended the party describing the homeless girl who had tried to con the Harringtons with a fake story about Deshawn's birth mother, Dorothy knew she had to act or spend the rest of her life knowing she had failed Regina twice. So Dorothy tracked down Celeste, finding her 3 days after the party sleeping in a bus station, with everything she owned stuffed into a single backpack. Dorothy sat down beside this broken young woman and opened the folder she had been hiding for over 2 decades, the folder containing proof that the Harrington adoption was built on fraud, coercion, and the systematic violation of Regina Foster's rights as a mother. Dorothy explained everything to Celeste in that bus station, while security guards eyed them suspiciously and announcements echoed about departing routes to cities where Celeste might disappear forever if she chose to give up. She told Celeste about the money that had changed hands, about the lawyer who had pressured Regina to sign papers while she was barely conscious, about the hospital staff who had been instructed to keep mother and baby separated to prevent bonding that might complicate the adoption. Dorothy revealed that Regina had tried to get her baby back 5 years after the adoption, filing petitions and hiring lawyers with money she had saved from working 3 jobs. But every legal avenue had been blocked by the Harrington family's lawyers who claimed Regina was unstable and potentially dangerous. The courts had sided with the wealthy family, who could provide stability, over the struggling single mother, who could offer only love, and Regina's parental rights had been permanently terminated, based on documents that Dorothy now suspected contained forged signatures and manufactured evidence of Regina's supposed unfitness. Dorothy gave Celeste copies of everything she had hidden, evidence that could potentially overturn the adoption's legality, or at minimum expose the Harringtons as people who had paid to steal a baby from a mother who never wanted to give him up. Celeste took the documents with shaking hands and asked Dorothy why she was helping now, after staying silent for 23 years, and Dorothy's answer was brutally honest. She explained that she had been young and scared when the adoption happened, intimidated by her supervisors, who made it clear that questioning wealthy clients could end her career before it started, and she had told herself that Regina would move on and build a new life, while the baby thrived with parents who could give him advantages his birth mother never could. But Regina had never moved on, and Dorothy had watched from a distance as this woman destroyed herself, searching for a son who had been deliberately hidden from her, dying alone without ever knowing whether her baby was safe or loved, or even alive. Dorothy told Celeste that she couldn't bring Regina back or undo decades of injustice, but she could make sure Regina's story was finally told, and that the people who had profited from her suffering faced consequences for building their perfect family on stolen motherhood. Dorothy gave Celeste the name of a lawyer, a civil rights attorney named Lawrence Gibson, who specialized in cases involving adoption fraud and institutional corruption, someone who would take on the Harringtons, despite their wealth and influence, if the evidence was solid enough to support legal action. Lawrence Gibson reviewed Dorothy's documents in his cluttered office that smelled like old paper and righteous anger, and after 2 hours of studying every page, he looked at Celeste with the kind of fierce determination that had made him legendary in legal circles, despite operating on a shoestring budget. He told Celeste that what the Harringtons had done was not just morally wrong, but legally actionable, that Regina's rights had been violated in ways that might not overturn the adoption after 23 years, but would absolutely expose systemic corruption in how wealthy families manipulated adoption systems to acquire children while erasing birth parents who got in the way of their perfect family narratives. Lawrence filed a lawsuit 3 weeks later, not just against the Harringtons, but against the adoption agency, the hospital, and every institution that had participated in separating Regina from her baby without ensuring she had proper representation or adequate time to make an informed decision. The lawsuit hit the news like an explosion, with headlines screaming about billionaire families and stolen babies and decades-long cover-ups that implicated some of the city's most respected institutions in systematic violations of vulnerable mothers' rights. The public response was immediate and divided, with some people supporting Celeste as a hero who had exposed corruption, while others believed the Harrington family's narrative that she was a con artist, exploiting a tragic situation for personal gain and attention. Brianna Harrington went on television with tears streaming down her face, explaining that her brother had been victimized by a manipulative woman who targeted him specifically because of his adoption story. that Celeste had befriended a mentally unstable homeless woman who claimed to be Deshawn's mother and was now using that connection to destroy their family. Vivian appeared at charity events, looking dignified and wounded, telling sympathetic supporters that her family was being persecuted by someone who could not accept that Deshawn had been loved and raised well by the only parents who had ever truly wanted him. The media loved the story because it had everything: wealth and poverty, race and class, birth mothers and adoptive families, the perfect storm of controversial topics that generated endless debate and drove ratings through the roof. But beneath all the noise and spin, Dorothy's documents told a clear story, and that story was making important people very nervous about what else might be uncovered if investigators started looking seriously at how adoption systems operated when wealthy families were involved. The trial was scheduled for 4 months later, and in that time, Celeste lived in a tiny apartment that Lawrence helped her find, surviving on donations from supporters who believed her story and working part-time at a nonprofit that helped homeless women navigate social services. She spent her days preparing for testimony, reviewing documents with Lawrence, and trying not to think about Deshawn and whether he believed she had ever truly loved him, or if Vivian's poison had completely destroyed whatever they had built together. Dorothy became something like family to Celeste, a grandmother figure who visited regularly with food and encouragement and stories about Regina that helped Celeste remember why this fight mattered beyond her own pain. And then, 2 weeks before the trial, Deshawn appeared at Celeste's apartment building, waiting outside until she came home from work, his face showing the strain of someone who had not been sleeping well. He told Celeste that he needed to know the truth, that he had spent months trying to believe his mother's version of events, but could not ignore the documents that had been filed with the court or the testimony from Dorothy that contradicted everything Vivian had told him about his adoption. Deshawn asked Celeste to tell him everything about Regina, about their meeting and Regina's final days, and the promise that had set all of this in motion. Celeste invited him inside her small apartment that was barely bigger than a closet, and made him tea while she told him about finding his mother collapsed on a sidewalk, about holding her hand in the hospital while she died, about the photograph Regina had carried for 23 years, showing herself at 16, holding her newborn son. She told Deshawn about Regina's decades searching through adoption agencies and foster care systems, about the jobs she worked and the shelters where she slept, about how his mother had never given up hope of finding him even when everyone told her to move on. Deshawn cried while listening to this story of a mother he had never known, a woman who had loved him so completely that it destroyed her life. And when Celeste finished talking, he asked if he could see Regina's letter, the one Brianna had torn at the engagement party. Celeste had spent weeks carefully taping the pieces back together, preserving every word of Regina's final message to her son, and she gave it to Deshawn, knowing that whatever happened next, she had finally kept her promise to a dying woman. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial, with media crews fighting for position and community members lining up hours early to secure seats for what everyone knew would be explosive testimony about one of their city's most prominent black families. Judge Patricia Monroe, a no-nonsense jurist known for her intolerance of both fraud and families who thought wealth placed them above the law, presided over proceedings with stern efficiency that suggested she would tolerate no theatrics from either side. Lawrence called Dorothy Kane as his first witness, and for 3 hours she testified about every detail of Regina's adoption case, about the pressure to rush paperwork, about the money that had changed hands, about her supervisor who had been fired years later for unrelated corruption, but had been taking payments from wealthy families throughout his career. The Harrington legal team tried to discredit Dorothy by suggesting she was motivated by guilt rather than truth, but her testimony was supported by documents that couldn't be explained away. Financial records showing suspicious payments and medical charts proving Regina had been in no condition to make legal decisions when she signed away her parental rights. Then Lawrence called Dr. Helen Torres, the physician who had treated Regina during her medical crisis, and she testified that Regina had been heavily medicated and clinically depressed when the adoption lawyer appeared at her bedside, that no competent medical professional would have approved legal proceedings under those circumstances, and that she had documented concerns in Regina's chart that were mysteriously missing from the official records the hospital later provided to the adoption agency. The defense fought back aggressively, calling character witnesses who testified about Celeste's history of instability and homelessness, suggesting that her entire relationship with Regina had been calculated to position herself for financial gain by attaching herself to whatever story might give her leverage over a wealthy family. They presented evidence that Celeste had researched the Harrington family extensively before applying for a job at their estate, arguing that this proved premeditation and intent to deceive rather than genuine concern for Regina's wishes or Deshawn's right to know his origins. Catherine Brooks, the lead defense attorney, delivered passionate arguments about how adopted children deserved stability and how birth parents who signed legal documents surrendering their rights could not simply change their minds years later when they regretted difficult decisions made under challenging circumstances. But the defense strategy began to crumble when Lawrence called a forensic document analyst who testified that signatures on several key adoption documents did not match Regina's handwriting samples from that time period, suggesting that someone had forged her consent on papers that legally terminated her parental rights forever. The courtroom erupted with shocked murmurs, and Judge Monroe had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order, while Vivian Harrington's face went pale, and her lawyers huddled in urgent whispered conference. Then Lawrence did something unexpected by calling Deshawn Harrington to the stand as a witness, and the entire courtroom fell silent as the young man walked to the witness box, with his mother's eyes burning into his back, like she could control him through sheer force of will. Deshawn testified that he had always known he was adopted, but had never been told that his birth mother had searched for him, that he had specifically asked his parents multiple times whether there was any way to contact the woman who gave birth to him, and been told firmly that she had wanted nothing to do with him after signing the adoption papers. He described the moment Celeste gave him Regina's letter, how reading his birth mother's words had shattered everything he thought he understood about his identity and his family's integrity. Deshawn's voice broke as he told the court that he now believed his entire life had been built on lies, that the parents who claimed to love him had deliberately kept him from knowing a mother who had never stopped searching, that they had paid money to ensure Regina could never find him, even when she was dying, and desperate for one final chance to tell her son she loved him. The defense tried to discredit Deshawn's testimony by suggesting Celeste had manipulated him emotionally, but his pain was too raw and genuine to be dismissed as performance, and several jurors were openly crying by the time he stepped down from the witness stand, looking 10 years older than when he had taken the oath to tell the truth. Judge Monroe delivered her ruling 3 days later, after reviewing all evidence and testimony with a thoroughness that had made her reputation as someone who could not be swayed by wealth or influence when justice was at stake. She found that Regina Foster's parental rights had been terminated through fraudulent means involving coercion, inadequate legal representation, forged documents, and systematic violations of procedures designed to protect vulnerable mothers from being pressured into decisions they were not capable of making while recovering from medical trauma. The judge ruled that while Deshawn's adoption could not be legally reversed after 23 years, the Harrington family and every institution involved in processing the adoption had violated Regina's civil rights in ways that demanded accountability and restitution. Judge Monroe ordered a full criminal investigation into Harrington and Associates' adoption practices, and within weeks, prosecutors had uncovered evidence of similar fraud in 7 other cases where wealthy families had paid to expedite adoptions while erasing birth parents who might complicate their perfect family narratives. Vivian and Gerald Harrington were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, and their carefully constructed empire began collapsing as business partners distanced themselves and community leaders who had once sought their approval now publicly condemned their actions. Brianna Harrington, who had managed the family's finances and knew about the payments to Dorothy's supervisor, was offered a plea deal in exchange for testifying against her parents, and she took it immediately to avoid prison time. The social consequences were even more devastating than the legal ones, with the Harrington name becoming synonymous with corruption and stolen motherhood. Their charitable donations suddenly unwelcome at organizations that did not want to be associated with people who had built their legacy on another woman's suffering. Deshawn sold his shares in the family business and donated the money to establish the Regina Foster Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping birth mothers fight for their rights and ensuring that adoption systems could not be manipulated by wealthy families who treated children like commodities to be acquired through checkbooks and legal maneuvering. He and Celeste never rekindled their romantic relationship because too much pain stood between them and the trust had been shattered beyond repair. But they became partners in honoring Regina's memory by making sure her story prevented other mothers from experiencing the same systematic erasure. On the 5th anniversary of Regina's death, the city unveiled a memorial bench in the park where she used to sleep, with a plaque that read her name and the dates of her life, and a quote she had once said to Celeste in the hospital: "Love doesn't end when the system says it does." Hundreds of people attended the dedication ceremony. Birth mothers and adoptees, and social workers and activists, all united by the understanding that Regina Foster's story mattered not because it had a happy ending, but because it exposed truths that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Celeste stood beside Deshawn at that ceremony, and when it was his turn to speak, he told the assembled crowd that he had spent 23 years not knowing his birth mother's name and would spend the rest of his life making sure the world never forgot it, that Regina Foster had taught him through her absence that love was not about possession or legal documents, but about fighting for someone even when every system designed to protect families told you to give up, and that the greatest gift anyone could give was keeping a promise to someone who could no longer fight for themselves. The story of Regina Foster and her stolen son spread across the country, inspiring adoption reform legislation in 3 states and forcing agencies to implement new protections for birth mothers who faced pressure to surrender their babies. Celeste eventually became a social worker herself, using her education and her experience to help other young women navigate systems designed to separate families while claiming to protect children. And every year on the anniversary of Regina's death, Celeste and Deshawn returned to that memorial bench to leave flowers and remember a mother whose love had survived everything, even death itself, even the deliberate erasure of her existence, even the money and power of people who thought they could rewrite history by destroying documents and silencing the inconvenient truth that some families are stolen rather than made.